Guten Morgen. Ich will auf Englisch sprechen, aber ich möchte zuerst etwas kurz auf Deutsch sagen. Ich freue mich, hier sehr zu sein und vielen Dank, Kirsten, das war sehr nett. Ich habe Deutsch in der Schule gelernt und ich habe einmal jahrelang in Deutschland gewohnt, aber das war vor 35 Jahren. Und ich habe inzwischen kein einziges Wort Deutsch gesprochen und ich habe fast alles vergessen. Aber meine Lehrerin in der Schule, sie war fantastisch. Sie hat uns inspiriert, sie hat uns nach Deutschland gebracht. Wir liebten Deutschland und Deutsch und ich fand das fantastisch. Meine beste Freundin ist jetzt die irische Botschafterin in Berlin und Sie können sehen, dass wir alle Deutschland lieben. Ich weiß, dass mein Deutsch altmodisch und begrenzt ist, aber ich weiß auch, dass Sie alle immer auf Englisch arbeiten muss und ich meine Muttersprache sprechen kann. Und ich möchte auch Danke sagen. Ich weiß, dass es nicht so einfach für alle ist, aber ich habe auch ich kann sehen, dass alle Leute hier sehr gut Englisch sprechen können. So, mit das gehe ich los. So. And now I have to say something interesting in English. Kirsten, so my talk is called Forests and Signals, and I'm sure from what Kirsten said you can guess why I have called it that talk, but I will get back to that in a moment. So just to say, this is a picture of Trinity. This is what we call our front square. And Kirsten already mentioned in her speech that there are a lot of similarities and connections between Trinity and Freiburg. So we're both very old universities. You are much older than us. We were founded in 1592. And the interesting thing about Liru and the universities that are in Liru that Kirsten mentioned is that 85% of the universities in Liru are older than the state they're in. And I think that's a very interesting fact, because I think one thing that it does say is that you have resilience. And I agree with Kirsten's description of the world at the moment. It's very complex, very challenging, very demanding. It's difficult for our students. But I think one good thing that we know at the back of our minds is that we have survived many things over the decades. We're also similar in size. We have about 23,000 students. We're both what we call comprehensive universities, where we go from health sciences to STEM to arts humanities. We have about 33% of our students not from Ireland. We work in a very different funding model, so it's important to us for cultural reasons and for economic reasons that we have international students. And there is a lot, I think, to connect the two universities. And I'm really, really pleased to be here in this wonderful university. And one of the things I was saying to Kirsten is I can sense in the air the passion you all have for this excellence initiative and where you're going next. And that's something really wonderful to feel. As I mentioned, and as Kirsten mentioned, when I had to say the three words that connected us, I also spoke about the new. This is one of our newest buildings from the air in Trinity. So we're also about pushing to the future. And I think, and maybe every generation thinks this, but I do think it's a very difficult future at the moment. And it's a difficult time for universities in navigating that. So it gives me, I think I am delighted to be here to talk about those things. Kirsten did a fantastic job of summarising a lot of the issues that face the world. So what I decided to do today is just take two perspectives. And I took the two perspectives, I borrowed the words from your excellence initiatives. So I was very impressed with your future forest work and SIPS, as you call it. I didn't know that's the SIPS initiative. So I just want to stress, I'm not an expert on forests and I'm not an expert on anything to do with biology, but I thought what you were talking about in those is really important, and they help me frame this talk that I want to give to you. So I'm going to start with forests and move on to signals and say a few words about, I think, the future. So starting with forests. So in Trinity, we have a botanical garden. It goes back to the 1700s. And I just thought I might introduce one. It's a small project that we have called the Witness Tree Project. So this is one of our oak trees. And in the Witness Tree Project, it's really interesting. You recruit trees to act as witnesses to the world around you. So we have 21 trees. And these are the beautiful leaves from each of those trees that are in this Witness Tree Project and are kind of saying what's happening in the world. And it's really, really interesting. I'm an engineer, as Kirsten says, but actually these trees are acting as sensors in the world. And by looking at what you find in the leaves or actually putting things on the trees to measure, you can tell what's happening in your environment. And when I look across this university and all of the work that you're doing, I suppose the next few slides I'm showing are not news to you. I don't need to tell you anything about what's happening in the world. You know really, really well. But I thought it was worth emphasizing a few of the key things. So you might be familiar with these. I'm sure most people have seen these. These are called the climate stripes. And this is about the 1800s. And this is today, and they show the average temperature of the world and how the world has been heating up. So they were invented or created by a person called Ed Hawkins, and we're delighted now that Ed is actually an honorary fellow in Trinity, and he's involved in one of our major collaborations called Climate Plus. It's a research centre that spreads all across Ireland and also is involved with the universities in the UK, and he's based in the UK. And he came to speak to us in Trinity recently. And even though, and one of the reasons I decided to use these climate stripes here is because even though I know this, and I've seen this before, when every single time he talks about it, and he's an amazing speaker, every single time he talks about it, you're reminded of the state that the world is in. And you're reminded how difficult the environment is becoming. So, I noticed, and I had a look, that you guys in Freiburg understand the climate stripes, and I found this wonderful picture of how the climate stripes are used to get that message out there, and I thought it was really beautiful. And we've done the same ourselves. This is the front of Trinity College, and we have projected the climate stripes onto that. Because what we find in the world today is we find that no matter how loudly you speak about this, it's not loud enough, and no matter how often you say this is an issue, and no matter how much research you do on it, it still is not enough. And I think that is a very, very important point to make. And what we see as well is we now see the biodiversity loss stripes. I don't know whether you've seen those before, but they're on top here, and the darker green shows the kind of biodiversity that was in the world. And we all know that as time is going on, in tandem with climate, that biodiversity loss is greater and greater and greater. There's some wonderful images of this online where you see pictures of, various different plants and those numbers of plants reducing as we go along. And we know that these two things are in a very complex way and an intimate way interrelated. But I think sometimes we don't stand back enough and say, what does that all mean for us? And what does that mean for research? And what does that mean for where we're going? So the biodiversity loss doesn't just mean the air might be poor, or we don't have enough water, or we don't have enough food. It has deep implications for research. And I was reading some very, very interesting articles about how through research we often understand how the world works by looking at certain species and investigating them in detail. And if those no longer exist, that window into the world and understanding how things kind of work becomes harder. Not to mention the fact there's a hugely different profile of disease and health issues. We have, for example, projects that look at maternal health in Africa. and how the heat and the change in temperature makes it totally difficult to give birth, and changes the whole landscape. So these changes make a material difference for us. And I was speaking to somebody yesterday who told me, for example, summers in Freiburg are much warmer now. We've no such problem in Ireland. It's never warmer, and we still have the rain. But ultimately, these materially affect us in every which way. So the really key thing is when you superimpose this onto kind of how old you are and where you sit. So I won't tell you exactly, but I sit between the second layer and the third layer there. And sometimes when I think about the future, when I feel I'm shirking my responsibility, I'm glad that I am the age I am. And I was talking to some people last night at the wonderful event that Kirsten had, who are very proudly speaking about their grandchildren. But if you look at this and you start to think of your grandchildren, I suppose we're reminded yet and yet again the ages those children will be as the world gets more and more difficult to deal with. And I think this morning, if you look at the news, I read that Qatar and the US are pushing back against the latest environmental rules that the EU has issued that come out of the Paris Agreement. And you can see that short-term thinking and thinking about just in the moment and thinking about what actually makes sense from a, I suppose, economic point of view in terms of how I make the most money now is absolutely dominating every single thing that we do. So in Trinity and in Freiburg, we do a lot of work to push back against these things. This is an example of the front of Trinity. And if I don't know whether here many people have ever visited Trinity, but in the past, if you visited Trinity, this would have been a pristine, cut really, really short lawn, and absolutely beautiful. And when you go in the front gate, also you would have seen pristine lawns. And they're not like that anymore. And we absolutely know that this is symbolic. We absolutely know that this is not going to save the world. This is part of what we call our nature positive approach to the university, and how we make the university nature positive by 1/3 of it going back to full nature. But it is really interesting. I get many, and I don't know, Kirsten, do you do? I get the usual letters of complaint that people send in, and it's very interesting the number of complaints I get about this. So I guess we'll say alumni coming back, telling me it's a disgrace that they're walking through what was once a beautiful university and what has this at the front of it. And why that's really, really interesting is because we talk the talk, but we don't often walk the walk. And something as simple as rewilding in the university, which we know, as I said, we're not by any way arrogant to say this solves everything, but we know ourselves from the biodiversity audits that we do in the university that biodiversity is increased. But we know ourselves that even this gesture is something that people find difficult, and that gesture is not even impacting their individual lives. And this is a picture of one of our wonderful researchers, Jenny McElwain. And because we've actually rewilded this, we discovered that rare orchids began to grow. And it was very, very interesting to see these rare orchids. I won't be able to tell you the exact details. I know we have experts in plants in this audience. But the interesting thing, on the one hand, while people push back against this gesture, when I went around the world and met people in different places, and as Kirsten will know, we're constantly telling the story of our university, the rare orchid story was a story that people remembered. So you have this kind of thing where people on the one hand are pushing back, and on the other hand, really, really kind of open and excited about these new things that are happening. So I suppose in kind of bringing this piece of this part of the talk to some kind of points, I think I don't need to persuade this university that climate change and biodiversity loss need to be the context for everything. And when I say that, They need to be the context for all of the research that we're doing, not just the research in these topics, but how we do all of the other research. I don't think I need to persuade everyone that the world has moved away from this thinking. I think Kirsten was talking about Europe having a strong voice, but you can see even in Europe where we were very strong, and to be perfectly honest, when I think of the green movement, I automatically think of Germany. I think this country started the green movement in a huge way, and any green politicians we have in Ireland were hugely influenced by Germany. But even in Europe, this has moved away. We have huge numbers of researchers working on this, but it's interesting if it starts to move away, and if you look at what's happening internationally, and Kirsten was talking about academic freedom as well, you see that academic freedom is being encroached. And one way that it's being encroached is to stop people doing research in areas connected with the environment. So if you look at what's happening in the US, you absolutely see that. And that is a huge worry. And I will give you one very practical example. So a lot of the universities around Europe who had research that was in collaboration with the US were asked to fill in surveys from the US government. And in those surveys, they asked you questions, very, very intrusive questions, but they wanted to know, was this research anything to do with the environment? Because if it's to do with the environment, that is not good. Was this research anything to do with inclusivity? That's not good. And went further in those surveys to ask us things about views on transgender, views on abortion, and whether or not we're patriotic in the context of the US. So I'm giving you that example as an example to show you there are not alone economic and political interests pushing back, but it can become harder and harder in this world to study and research the things that you want to study and research, and more importantly, to study and research the things that are so desperately, desperately needed for the future of this world. And I say that because a number of years ago, I used to kind of use the word academic freedom without really thinking, but it's no longer something we can take for granted. And this is an absolutely really important area where you see that encroachment. And what we will see, and what we need to be really careful of, and that's why I love that Future Forests is an excellent cluster, we need to make sure that the research funding doesn't start to follow the rhetoric that we're seeing in the political world. So while we in Trinity try our best to do a lot of things in this area, and we also believe that all students should actually have some kind of education about sustainability, it can also be hard to make these choices. And let me give you an example. And I think this is a really, so because we're in an old university, and I'm sure you see our carbon footprint is poor. And actually to make the kind of multi-million investment we need means you don't invest in other things in the university. And it is the exact same thing as saying to many companies who might be in the audience here, will you do the right thing and be greener when no one else of your competitors is? And that is increasingly the world that we're facing, where you in a more lonely way, on your own, have to be strong enough to do the right thing, and that doing the right thing can have competitive implications for you. And I think it's important to think about this. And we're here talking about excellence today, and I really applaud the wonderful ambition I see all around me here. But sometimes excellence is linked with going in the direction that push against the right things. And I say that, I'm here, I've traveled here for a short amount of time. A lot of what we want to do is be outward looking, especially in a small country like mine. It's always about engaging, doing things in other countries, having people traveling backwards and forwards, doing research in a particular kind of way. The AI that we all speak about hugely uses environmental, the amount of energy it uses is really challenging and difficult. So it's a very interesting world we're in, where we need to be hugely careful about academic freedom, where I know this university understands the importance of the environment, where we need to hold on to that. And we need to find ways forward where we can do the right thing for the world and think of those next generations to come. And at the same time, kind of try to be competitive and excellent. So that's kind of my perspective on that. So that's the forest perspective. So the signals perspective, I want to go on to that now. And I took this from your website. And I suppose the reason I put that there, and I said up front, biology actually was a subject I didn't do to my abitur in school, but I think it's just a fascinating area. And it's really, really interesting. So if you look at the description that your excellent cluster is about, and it talks about ensuring survival and health. So these organisms, they work together in a complex way to ensure survival and health. They share essential information and they allow the organs to adapt and thrive in changing conditions. And I love the way you speak about it. It's really poetic and beautiful. And I love this notion of the language of life. And I suppose what I'm talking about today are those signals and the signals in society as a whole. And I suppose what I want to say in a very simple way is that communication and those signals are hugely broken down. And when you think about that from the perspective of society at large, you think that if we don't have the right signals, how can we ensure survival and health, have essential information, adapt and thrive? And that's the kind of message I want to get across with this. So I'm an engineer, and I'm sure there may be some engineers in the audience. I can see a few people nodding. And oftentimes we talk about the signal to noise ratio. And when you talk about that, what you mean is you want the signal to be strong enough so the noise at the edges doesn't drown it out. And you can actually hear or pick up what somebody is going to say. But this is actually the world we live in today. So apart from the fact that the noise is huge, and that noise is huge for so many reasons. It can be the social media that you spoke about. It can be all sorts of other things. We also have conditions where the signal has been removed. And let me give you a few examples of that. In the US at the moment, they are simply wiping out databases with information and facts that people do not agree with. So if you don't like what the data and the science says, just erase it. And then you don't have to look at it. And there's even been situations where they haven't managed to erase the database and the person who's sharing the news, like for example, the employment statistics in the US, if you can't erase the database, just erase the person telling you the news. And that is the way the world is working. And while at one part, I was talking in Ireland in a kind of small country village at one stage, and I mentioned Donald Trump, and everyone laughed, and in one way saw it as he is over there. But this attitude is penetrating the whole world. How do I get rid of the signal? Or how do I dampen it down? Or how do I sow so much confusion nobody knows what's happening? So this is Oscar Wilde. I noticed there was a bar called Oscar Wilde's around the corner from the university. So Oscar Wilde went to Trinity. He's one of our famous graduates. And in a play called The Importance of Being Earnest, he made this statement: the truth is rarely pure and never simple. And that actually is the world that we're working in at the moment, where the truth is rarely pure and never simple. And this is the world and where you're trying to pick out the signal and figure out what the real signal is. So in the world I come from, and I'm not sure, and I was actually talking to Eva yesterday about this, do these words translate to German well enough? We talk about misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. So misinformation is false by mistake. I could be telling you something that I genuinely believe to be true, or I could understand something, in a limited way because it's very complex, and I'm passing it on, and it's misinformation. Disinformation is where it's false on purpose, and you will have heard huge amounts of coverage of this in the media, where there is a contrived effort to actually put information out there that drowns out the signal, that noise that sits in the... And then malinformation, that's what we refer to when we talk about something that's true, but it can be taken out of context. And actually the really interesting thing, and I can't say this for German newspapers, but even when I look at what I consider good Irish newspapers, and Ireland is a place of a lot of freedom of speech, and it isn't a country that has a lot of corruption or anything. I reckon when I look at a newspaper article, there is a huge amount of malinformation and a huge amount of misinformation on the innocent newspapers and a huge amount of disinformation on the rest of them. And it is a really complex world, and we're asking our students, and I know there's some wonderful students from Freiburg here today, we're asking our students to navigate this world. And of course, on top of all of this in the signal to noise, there's also opinion. So I might have a different opinion, a different interpretation. We have different political views in our universities and things, and that's also really, really important. So how do you look at all of this, and how do you understand which is which, and how do you make sense of it? And more importantly, how do you make sense of it when the machine is in the loop? And that, to me, is one of the biggest issues we have. So any misinformation, disinformation, or malinformation that we could spread throughout this room can spread gazillions of times faster and in a much more fundamentally effective and efficient way when you think about AI. And I've called this generation rather than generative AI because it's the AI generation that we are now all navigating. I'm absolutely delighted to see that Freiburg has a real focus on AI and where it's going. And I, coming from an engineering background, I'm always interested in new technologies, but this is a challenge, one of the biggest challenges for us. How do we navigate a world where the noise is so much greater than the signal? That noise, the misinformation, malinformation, the disinformation and malinformation is hugely exacerbated through these processes with the machine in the loop. And how do we create the next generation of critical thinkers who can sit, how do we ourselves able to sit above that? And the key thing for me, and it is one of the biggest things we face in the university and in the world, is the polarization that this leads to. And there has never been more polarized world. And I'm not just talking about, like, we see it very much, we'll say, in the US, because that's where all the headlines are. But I was looking yesterday, I noticed in Dublin, there was, and Dublin actually, Ireland is a very central kind of country where all of the politics kind of sits in the centre. But I noticed some very violent protests against immigrants at a venue in Dublin last night. And that's the kind of polarisation you have. And in the university, we do things to get beyond that polarisation. So this is our debating society. It's called the HIST. It's the oldest student society in the world. It's the oldest debating society in the world. And see this woman here, she's from the Guinness Book of Records. I think she looks exactly like a person might look from the Guinness Book of Records, confirming that we're the oldest society in the world. But for me, while this is good, and this is really important that we have that debate in the university, it's not enough. And I put this slide here because I think this speaks to what I want to say before I wrap this up. So we have two people here who live in very, very different worlds. So we have aging, longitudinal aging studies. We do a lot of work on aging in Trinity. And the person on the left is a homeowner. They live to beyond 80. They have strong cognitive development. Actually, when they go to hospital, they finish the treatment. And I put in a random piece of information. They walk faster than the person in this. It's incredible how poverty and how you walk actually matters. This person's homeless. They age over 3 times faster. They live till they're 32. They walk slower. They have lots of things wrong with them. When they go to hospital, they don't finish treatments. And there is a biological imprint on them in terms of their cognitive ability and in terms of their ability to make decisions because of their poverty. And these are also completely polarized worlds. And these people do not come into contact with each other or do not have the conversations that we should. And unless we, as universities, and in Trinity, we are very interested in poverty and health. But it is really, really, when I talk about the polarized world, you can talk about it in a political context, but you can talk about it in the fact that people are living in different bubbles. And I thought it might be interesting. I have 2 stats here from what they call the Edelman Trust Barometer. I don't know whether people are familiar with this. It's a trust barometer that people look at every year. And in this, they're saying that only 36% of people think the next generation will be better off. And in Germany, that's 14% of people think the next generation will be better off. And going back to my example about the protest in Dublin, this is even more stunning. The next one. Sorry. For some reason, the slide isn't. I'm pointing to the right. Oh, yep, sorry, to go back. This is even more worrying. 40% of people think that hostile activism is the only means to drive change. And if you look at this age group, 1 in 2 of young people think no one is listening to me. I can't make any change in the world unless I'm hostily active. And this, if you look at that Edelman Trust Barometer, is part of what they call the grievance. We're in a world where grievances are held closely. And if you're in one bubble and somebody else is in the other bubble and they have something and you don't, that grievance culture is building and building and building. So I suppose what I want to say when I talk about signals, ultimately, is I want to say the noise is drowning out the signal. It's drowning out truth. It's drowning out science. It's one of the biggest things we face, the derision of the wonderful work that we do, the derision of expertise. The machine is playing a huge part in that. We do an awful lot to try get the signal out there. We go beyond it. All of our universities do huge amounts of public engagement. We do thousands of public engagement events every year in Trinity. But we're in a bubble talking to ourselves more often than not. And even when we do those public engagements, we're talking to like-minded people. So ultimately, I'd say here, we need to ask ourselves, who is our excellence in service of? So I think it's brilliant to be excellent. It's brilliant to be ambitious. But we need to think for who and who is that about as universities. And they're really, and I know people will argue it's not the job of university to make the world perfect. But for me, there's no point to a university unless it's continually serving and challenging society. So in conclusion, just to say a small few things, we launched our own strategic plan last week. It was called Thrive. And to me, it's a call to my university to how do we as a community thrive? How do we get better at what we do? But how do we make the world thrive? It's also a call, and kind of wraps up what I'm saying. In the past, I would have had probably a kind of bland mission statement there. But to me, it's about fiercely defending what I believe is the transformative power of education and research. It's not something you just do. You have to now fiercely defend if we really believe in it. And it's about challenging and serving society. And I know Kirsten is really keen about how in the future we do that, we keep up with it, and we're able for that. And I think it's really important. So I thought it would just be interesting to end that. And for me, we need to make the signal, truth, research and evidence stronger. So with that, I want to say thank you to all. I thought you might be interested in this. There's an artist that I came across called Katie Holden, and she made an alphabet. So all of this alphabet is related to a particular tree. So the name of the tree begins with the letter. It's a very simple code. So I thought I would say thank you. And this thing called Danka in the Irish tree language, which for me shows the layers of stuff. So thank you. Thank you.